Good morning, everybody. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Everybody ready for another half day? Sorry, only half. We're very honored to have with us the Consul General from the United States, a dear friend of the program, and a consistent participant in the U.S. Politics Now conference, Ben Wallauer. I'd like to greet you this morning.
Thanks to NYU for hosting this annual event, which has become one of the fixtures on the Florence calendar every year. And I think it's great. As representative of the U.S. government here, I think it's wonderful to have the opportunity to bring such experts over to talk about the midterm elections, in this case, whatever election we happen to be in, or just generally the political scene. As a career diplomat and civil servant, I always prefer to let real experts from Washington come and New York to come talk about what's going on back home, and then I can just, sort of copy their statements later on. So I won't say anything about the U.S. domestic politics now, but I do want to make just a few brief points about the international context in which the U.S. domestic political scene is operating. First of all, there's a tremendous interest in Italy about the midterm elections in general, about the U.S. domestic political scene. We've had a number of requests for speakers on the midterm elections here and also up in Bologna, so that shows that there really is still a concentration and focus on the United States. The U.S. really remains a or even the country of reference for Italy. Three brief points I will make about the U.S. in Italy and Europe. First of all, the U.S. and Italy have one of the strongest relationships of any country that I've ever experienced in my 20 years in the Foreign Service. It's a bilateral partnership that's based on millions and millions of individual partnerships between people, between institutions like universities, between companies, etc. And this is a relationship that has flourished over the years with a tremendous amount of shared history in good times and bad. And it means we're at a point now where U.S. and Italian leadership have a very strong relationship at a personal level and also at a policy level. We don't agree on everything, naturally, but it's at a very good point, and as an evidence of that is the new strategic partnership that the U.S. President Trump and Prime Minister Conte agreed to undertake, where there'll be structured dialogue on a number of key issues of cooperation, particularly in the security and economic sphere. Second point I'd like to make is about the U.S. and Europe going one step above. And I think despite what one might think or hear or read, the U.S. relationship with Europe and in Europe remains extremely strong. Europe remains, both from NATO and the military perspective, but also political and economic, a fundamental part of our foreign policy. Again, there are things that we disagree on, and we're discussing and negotiating. I think about NATO and the desire to have our NATO partners meet the 2% promise made several years ago. We're talking about trade issues. We're talking about Iran sanctions, Russia sanctions. But I think even though that there are these discussions and negotiations going on,
tweets. Let's get to it here. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that that overall the relationship isn't extremely strong, and that the United States doesn't consider Europe a fundamental part of our foreign policy abroad. And finally, why is this important? Why is it important that the U.S. and Italy have a strong relationship? And why is it important that Europe remain a cornerstone of our foreign policy. It's because Europe, and not just Western Europe, but Central Europe, Eastern Europe, is a geopolitical is a location where competition at the geopolitical strategic level is occurring in a way that we haven't seen in many years. The Cold War is over, yes, but geopolitical competition is occurring here, and it's occurring all around. We have the traditional competition, let's say, from Russia, concerns that we've had for many years, but we're also thinking more about the southern frontier, which is Italy's major foreign policy concern. We're thinking about also China's increasing involvement economically in Eastern and Central Europe in particular. So there's a lot of what's going on in Europe now remains central to our foreign policy strategy and foreign policy national security interests. So again, U.S. and Italy's strong partnership, U.S. and Europe's strong partnership are fundamental to addressing these strategic challenges moving forward. So that's the context in which I'm working, and our embassy in Rome is working now, and that's probably the topic for another conference. So I'll leave the foreign policy discussion there and look forward to listening to these experts here talk about our domestic situation. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
And a very good morning it is. So, Jonathan, would you like to begin with a song?
No.
Or should we just
Do
start
you have
with...
anything in mind? I can take some requests here, actually.
All right, there's two Jonathans. You were talking to Martin.
I was talking
Great.
about Jonathan Martin. Anybody who was with us last night knows what a rock and roll star he is.
Purple Rain. Little Rain.
Little meatloaf. Little meatloaf. There
Little
you go.
meatloaf. So we've got a little under an hour today, and we're going to talk about the mass media, and is the mass media a symptom or a cause of the division that we see in America today? And I'm looking forward to a great conversation. We've got a distinguished panel. So if you want to understand who they are or why they're distinguished, there are bios in your pack. We won't start with introductions. We'll just start with questions. And we're going to cover a little bit of both the traditional media and social media, because social media has become such a big part of the conversation and to many people's minds a big driver of the divisions in our country. So we're going to do both. But let's start high and at a high level. And I'd like to just get a quick read from everybody here, starting with Betsy. So start thinking, Betsy.
Okay.
Is the division that we see in the country today fanned by and caused by the media, or is the media simply reflecting what's already there?
I think to a large degree it's reflecting, but I also think it amplifies sort of the polarization that we see in politics. And I think, we're in a situation where, people are watching two totally different realities on cable. You have one reality happening on a CNN, and you have a total other reality happening on Fox. And people go in their silos, stay in their bubbles, and you can consume the news that you want to consume at any given time. And so it serves as an amplifier, I think, to the polarization that is going on.
Michael?
Yeah, I appreciate the amplification part of it, because I think that's a key element. But I think also what I witnessed over the past 3 years, sitting on various sets and being in various media spaces, that there was particularly with Trump, sort of a corrosive symbiotic relationship that emerged, that developed, when ratings and profits translated favorably. And it became a matter of if the president, then candidate, said something, the press, instead of stepping back and evaluating what was said as it traditionally would do, just went full board into it and literally would spend 6 hours of coverage on a tweet. And that level, and as reports have shown, that level of engagement by the media translated into billions of dollars, about $8 billion of free advertising that no other candidate in the race, including Hillary Clinton, was able to garner. I mean, imagine Tim Russert allowing a candidate for the presidency of the United States to call in to meet the press. It just never happened.
Didn't happen.
It
no.
didn't. It just.
Only time we had call-ins was, if there was some foreign correspondent
Exactly.
overseas or some
Exactly.
sort of breaking news overseas.
Exactly, and it really spoke to the transformation in the relationship between the media and its coverage of an individual, and that individual's manipulation of that coverage. And I can't fault him for that. I mean, look, if I'm going to throw a bright shining object on the air and up in the air and everybody's going to chase it into a rabbit hole, I'll do that every time. And that's what we've seen. So in terms of how this has played itself out, I think the symbiosis between the two drive each other. I really think between the covered and those who are doing the covering, they've come to an accommodation. And we are the witnesses of that every single day as we sit there with our popcorn, just sort of taking it all in.
Jonathan?
Popcorn and adult beverage of your choice. So I just want to add, I agree with everything Betsy said and with what Chairman Steele said. Let me amplify on one thing Betsy talked about. The silos is, I think, the downside of the democratization of information that comes with the internet. When it comes to people living in their own worlds, to understand the import of Fox News, I mean, yeah, you've got one part of the country watching CNN, but you have a majority, at least of the cable viewership, is watching Fox. And that's what makes what's reported on Fox, to my mind, so problematic. So while the rest of us might be enraged or concerned about children being separated at the border from their families, Fox News is covering maybe Hillary Clinton's emails or something else. The other thing is, to jump off of what Michael is talking about, the other issue here is President Trump, as candidate and now as president, he sort of exacerbates things by lying all the time. And I'm not making a partisan comment. If you go to the Washington Post fact checker, you will see we're like counting the number of lies that he says. And so if the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and MSNBC cover what he's saying and the lies that he's telling, but Fox News doesn't, that adds to what I guess you call it polarization, but I've taken to calling it, we've got two different planets, Earth 1 and Earth 2. And I get lots of emails from folks on Earth 2 who, say that I'm part of the fake news and everything. And then one last thing, again to Michael's point about then candidate Trump, I think one of the reasons, maybe the reason why the cable networks and just journalists in general just heaped coverage on Trump was because really no one thought he was going to win. And he was pure entertainment.
Ratings too. Ratings.
Yeah, no, that's right. No,
Money.
he was pure entertainment. Here's this guy, he's running for president, and the first words out of his mouth are Mexicans are rapists. And then he keeps going down the line. I started taking him seriously as a candidate 1 month after his announcement when he attacked then Senator John McCain and denigrated his service, the former nominee of his party. And his poll numbers went up. That's when I realized this guy, you cannot underestimate him. Even though he's entertainment, this guy he's hitting on something. He's just amplifying something that's already out there. And our job as journalists
was to cover that. And luckily for me, as an opinion writer, I was able to say, here's what the tweet said, and here's how horrible it is.
Josh?
Okay, thanks, Steve. I want to push back on a little bit of something that Jonathan said, which I think is a common conception about the internet and the relationship between social media and political polarization, and in particular about this question of echo chambers, and whether or not people who are using social media find themselves in echo chambers. And the received wisdom on this is that you go on Facebook, you're surrounded by people who are really similar to you, you see the same information, it reinforces your pre-existing conditions, and we get this buildup of polarization off of these echo chambers. The research on actually what happens to people when they go on social media, though, presents a different picture here. The story in terms of about these echo chambers, the sort of big development on this is when we move from the older days in the United States, but pre-cable television, where we had the vast majority of the population was consuming news off of the three major networks, where you had 50 million people a night who were watching Dan Rather on CBS or Walter Cronkite on CBS, ABC, NBC. Marcus Pryor from Princeton University has a fantastic book called Broadcast Democracy, in which he traces what happens when you get cable news. Cable allows for a huge number of channels, and what ends up happening is that you have two things. One, people who don't want to consume news suddenly have huge numbers of options. You don't have to watch the news at 7 p.m. at night with the rest of the country. You can watch golf, or you can watch cooking shows, or you can watch sports during that time. But the people who do consume news suddenly have these more partisan options, in particular Fox News.
Right.
So set against that context, what happens when you get to the internet? Well, when you get to social media and the internet, and in particular social media, when people start going on Facebook, you have two things happen. One is this factor called inadvertent exposure. A lot of these people who've chosen to watch golf or watch ESPN instead of watching the news are on Facebook. And yes, we have large degrees of homophily on Facebook where liberals tend to have more liberals friends, but it's not exclusive. And the research shows that on average, liberals and conservatives both have about 20% friends on Facebook from the opposite political spectrum. So what ends up happening is you go on Facebook to be friends with your high school friends, see what they're coping up to, or your cousins who live in a different part of the country, and you do actually get exposure to information from the other side. And compared to the cable news network, compared to the cable era of the 1990s, we actually see people getting more exposure. So in research that our lab did, we looked at sharing of information across on Twitter, we looked at sharing of information across the ideological spectrum. And we found, yeah, most people are retweeting people of similar political persuasion. But even on the absolutely most polarized issues, you were still seeing about a quarter of the retweets were across the ideological spectrum. And when you moved from highly politicized issues like debates and elections into less politicized issues like the Oscars or the Super Bowl, these patterns would disappear entirely and you would see much more cross-ideological sharing. So it actually is quite variant depending on what the issue is, and some issues it even changes within time. So the net effect on polarization leads to an interesting question, because two goals that people often talk about simultaneously, wanting to reduce echo chambers, thinking that echo chambers are a bad thing for political polarization, a bad thing for democracy, or incivility online where people are getting into arguments and conflicts over politics. These things actually may not be able to be solved by the same policies, right? You want to keep people from getting into arguments online with other people, stick them in an echo chamber with people who entirely agree with each other. So what we don't know is sort of the net effect on polarization. Right? Is it the fact that this inadvertent exposure, which is exposing people to different views, and there's a lot of research that shows when you come into contact with people with different views, that makes you more open and less polarized. However, there's also research that shows when you have this in a kind of conflicting situation, that can actually harden your views. And coming back to this question of is it the media or not, one of the things we know is that elite cues play a large role in this, and the source of information can be very important, right? So when you have a John McCain saying that something the Republicans are doing is off the rails here, that's a very different message than a Democrat saying something is off the rails that the Republicans are doing. So I think it's important to sort of understand that the social media environment, we don't know, right, what its net effect on polarization is. But the echo chamber effect, I think, is overstated, and we're seeing more and more research that shows it actually on social media is getting you a sort of wider diversity of news content. And in part, that's driven by the fact that we consume social media in a different way than we did traditional media, right? When I'm reading the New York Times, I'm reading the New York Times because I think highly of the New York Times, or that's my local newspaper.
Thank you.
When we read social media, or the Washington Post, I should
Thank
say.
you.
When we read social media often because our friends have recommended things,
No.
right? And these social cues are just as important in terms of determining what we read as other types of things like the
Right.
algorithm it feeds up. And there's research again showing this. Anyway, so I'll say that to the intro.
Jonathan.
The gatekeepers have been demolished. Historically, there was a few dozen people who kind of decided what people saw and read in this country, right? I mean, it was a handful of papers, the three networks and PBS, and three news magazines, and they kind of decided what was going to be news, right? And there is a sort of small d democratization of news now. The challenge with that is that it becomes sort of harder to sort of suss out what's real and what's not real. I mean, I kind of think that we're coming back full circle in the country towards an earlier period of kind of pre-consensus journalism. Like the moment that we're going through looks more like the 19th century, where you had news outlets that were more partisan, and news and information was kind of received through a partisan lens. The last 50 years were kind of the exception to the rule of the country. The sort of post-World War II detached, neutral media was something different from the history of this country. I mean, if you just look at the newspapers in the 19th century or even the turn of the century, they were much more tilted towards a party or a faction. And so I kind of think that we're going back to that sort of similar place. What worries me is that people aren't going to have the ability to sort of suss out what's real and what's not real and what's credible and what's not. My hope is that because there are going to be so many sources of information flowing into people's phones and their computers, that prestige brands will still be able to survive because people are going to want reliable news and information. The more, pardon my French, crap they've got flowing at them, they're hopefully going to want to, be more dependent upon traditional news outlets to figure out what's real and what's credible and what's not. But I do worry that we're going through an intense period of kind of polarization. That I look at the results of the election last week, and I just sort of see it getting worse and worse. And I could go on all morning, but the two parties are now drawing much more reliable shares of votes. If you look at Tuesday's results compared to like a decade ago, there's fewer blowouts now in statewide elections, even where you have candidates who are lightly funded or sort of second tier or even marginal candidates. They still get like 40+% of the vote, almost no matter where you are. And I think the reason for that is because the parties are so sorted now that they automatically get a certain share of votes because people are just voting on the pure partisan label instead of voting on the individual. If you look at the results a decade ago of Senate races, you saw a lot wider margins. And I think that's changing because people now are just so locked in their silos that they show up to vote and they're now pulling one side or the other. It's a more parliamentary type deal. That's a little off topic, but I don't think it actually is. So.
No, I think it's very much on topic. This coming back to the sort of penny press, where every little newspaper had 1,000 subscribers and a different point of view is a really insightful comment.
Can I two-finger in just on the last thing Jonathan said about polarization? So I just saw a really interesting paper from a grad student at Harvard who's looking specifically at the question of whether the decline of local news sources is contributing to what Jonathan's talking about.
It's one of my obsessions.
Right, and so he makes this argument that without local news, you're more likely to rely on, so we've seen a decline in local news because of trends in the media markets that everyone's talking about.
Right.
And the argument is that with the decline of local news, you have more people voting straight ticket because they don't know things about their particular, they don't know things particular. And the way that he actually went and tested this was incredibly clever. He looked at people who were in the wrong local news media market. So people right on the border for their state. So that you live in Indiana, but you're in the Chicago news market, or you live in Kentucky and you're in the Ohio news market.
Yeah.
And what he found is that in people who were getting local news about the other state, you had higher propensity in those counties of straight ticket voting.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Right? So it's actually causal evidence that, and we know there's this huge macro level trend in the decline of local news and more straight ticket voting. So this is just on this
Yeah.
subject of what news is contributing. It's possible that the fact that local news was where you learned about your governor, your
Yes.
senator, and
It's
these kind of
huge.
races, and people are not consuming it nearly as much.
You can't overestimate how important this topic is, that the decline in state and local media has had an enormous effect on politics. And I think it does drive more straight partisanship because people just don't know the nuances of campaigns, of their candidates, of their lawmakers in a way that they used to. And I've lived this. I've lived this covering politics for the last 15 years. There used to be much more robust local press, more investigative stories. I mean, stories could really shake up a race. And now these state news organizations are just so depleted that it's all they can do, but just basically, the kind of daily he said, she said type reporting. There's very little investigative muscle left.
Is that largely because of the nationalization of local news? In other
Yeah.
words?
And resources.
And
resources,
Yeah, I mean, it's
yeah.
like the first thing they cut is the investigative team and then the political team. I mean, you walked into any state capitol 15 years ago, you'd see a press gallery full of reporters. You walk in there today, there's like 2 people there.
Yeah.
It just, doesn't exist anymore to a large extent. And I think it's all business, finance related. You just
Right.
can't afford it.
Jonathan Capehart, you were the first person
So
here to.
subscribe to your local paper back
Yes.
home.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jonathan, you were the first person to utter the words fake news. And you were the first person to utter the fact that that there was a period of time during which the media didn't take Trump seriously. They covered it like it was a carnival show or a reality show. So a friend of mine once said, he's a prominent Republican consultant, that the news media takes Trump literally but not seriously, and Trump voters take Trump seriously but not literally. So when the Washington Post says he's told 7,433 lies, his supporters say, yeah, but he was just trying to make a point. To what extent do you believe, A, when Donald Trump says fake news, he believes it? And to what extent do you believe that his followers believe it? And I direct that question both to you and Jonathan, Martin,
Yeah.
who are out there covering this in real time.
I think the president's supporters believe that it's all fake news. I think the president, I'm not willing to say that he believes that it's really fake news. I think he
doesn't.
sees that it works to his advantage to say that it's fake. At this point, we all know that whenever he brands something fake news, translation, news that I don't like.
Right.
I mean, that's what that is.
Essentially it, yeah.
But unfortunately, the people who support him, they believe him
Right.
when he says that it's fake news. And that gets to everything that we're talking about here, that we have a huge chunk of the American public who, when presented with a factual story that is critical of the president, they won't believe it.
Yeah.
The only upside, the only glimmer of hope that despite his railing about fake news and that the media is out to get me and I'm the most horribly covered president in the history of the republic, when Manafort was on trial and they came back and they were deadlocked on deadlocked on one. The woman who came out, the juror who came out and spoke, she's a diehard Trump supporter. She had a Make America Great Again hat in her car. She was full on in with the president. But when the former chairman of the president's campaign was on trial and she was presented with evidence in a court of law, she told the press that she wanted to, she thought he was guilty on all charges. And so the glimmer of hope is that facts still will win out. But when you're going up against, when it's the press versus the president is always going to win when it comes to his supporters.
No.
Jonathan?
Yeah, there is a gulf between what the president says and thinks about the press and what his supporters say and think about the press. Like, he doesn't actually mean it. I mean, it's just, it's funny. I get all these questions when I give talks like this from people. They say, "What's it like? The president hates you guys. He attacks you guys." And I find it so striking because he actually doesn't hate us. It's just the opposite. There's never been a president in the history of the country who's more consumed with press coverage, who so desperately wants the validation of the press than this president. He doesn't hate us, just the opposite. He's obsessed with us, and he covets the good favor of the press. I kind of have this like a daydream where like I kind of want to ask the president's supporters like why do you guys think he's so consumed with the media institutions that you hate so much, right? Because he spends so much of his time thinking about it and consumed by it, and he doesn't actually mean it. Like the idea that he somehow is not going to have the press cover him. That's like all he wants, right? That's the whole reason why he's there, is to get press coverage. Now, the challenge, though, is that his shtick may not be on the level, but his supporters think it is. And that's where it's dangerous, right? Is like they don't get the fact that he actually is doing a pro wrestling thing and that he actually doesn't believe the stuff that he says about us, and that it's kind of all with like a wink and a nod, you know? And that's why it's dangerous. Like when he's tweeting about like the Arizona Senate election and he floats the idea of like a revote, he doesn't believe that, and he doesn't even know if that's possible. He's just like watching cable and like reacting to it, and he doesn't give it. But like that has an impact, right? And when you say fake news over and over again, like even though that's just you reacting impetuously to bad coverage, your supporters think it's actually real, right? And that's where it's troublesome, is they don't get the nuance that this is all kind of like a wink and a nod. And some of them do, but a lot of them don't. Having covered some of these Trump rallies, you can tell the people who are kind of in on the joke and those who aren't. Because at these rallies, people will like come and scowl at you and hiss at you and yell and say nasty things. And what's interesting about that is that if you go and engage them, some of them will be perfectly nice because it's kind of like they're all play acting, but some of them actually believe the stuff, you know? It's a really fascinating sort of experiment, these rallies, because the TV people will invariably like pose for selfies and sign autographs. And it's like you were just screaming at this person a second ago, and now you're asking for their picture and their autograph. So in some ways, it's kind of reassuring. But there's a segment, though, that actually does believe this stuff. They do think that Trump actually hates us, and they think that like we are fake news, and they don't get that it's all kind of a joke. And that's what's worrisome, is the people who take his words literally and believe that like we are actually a threat to the country.
Well, let's keep in mind, though, we just went through a situation where pipe bombs were sent to leaders within the Democratic Party and folks on television because
they took it seriously.
They took him seriously.
Yes.
Sorry, Betsy.
Well, not to pile on cable news here, but I think cable environment has contributed a lot to the ability to be able to call something fake. When you have a cable news organization that is so overly opinionated on both sides, it sort of gives the opening to call something fake. I mean, if you're Fox News fair and balanced, it's not fair and balanced, just like MSNBC has a slant to it. But because you are allowing these opinions to be circulated, it gets us in the mode where news has a wide spectrum of opinion and straight, what I call capital J journalism reporting, and those lines get blurred, and it gives an opening to call something fake because it's opinionated.
So
I think if I could just real quick,
absolutely.
I think to Jonathan's point, Jonathan Martin's point, which is interesting, it is something that back during the early part of the 15-16 presidential election, one of the things that I thought Trump was masterful at, and why I was very critical of the Huffington Post when it decided that it would not cover his campaign seriously. And in fact, they would just cover it on the entertainment page.
Yeah.
What I think a lot of people missed was something that we've never seen done before, and that is Donald Trump had a relationship with his voters before they became his voters.
Yeah.
They were his audience. They watched him for the last 10 or so years
Right.
on, award shows, page 6 of the New York Post, certainly The Apprentice,
Right.
and a number of other media outlets. They consumed him, and he provided them full, unadulterated entertainment. I love the WWF reference because that's exactly what it was, and that's exactly what it is. For the first time in our real politics, we watched an individual convert his audience into voters. That's how he has a 40% lock. There are people who've been with him long before he decided to run for president. And it's something that the media still treats Donald Trump as if he's John McCain or Ted Kennedy, in the sense that he's, a politician who grew up in the system and is now manipulating the system. No, he's manipulating this system completely from the outside of it. And I go through this with my colleagues at MSNBC, and I already use a reference, stop following the bright, shining object. And we saw it just on the election, just this week. Donald Trump didn't want to talk about the fact that he lost the House of Representatives. So what did he shift the conversation to? Something else, right?
And picking a fight with
Picking fights with
press corps.
Okay, so here we are at this press conference, right? And the president hates CNN, hates CNN, dogs them at every turn. So let me ask you, if you hate me, right, and you now have this very tense relationship, are you going to engage with me? No. What does he do? He calls on Jim Acosta. Why? Because he wanted the fight. And he knew the minute he picked that fight, 1, Jim would take the bait. 2, his colleagues would then come to his defense, which we saw my colleague at MSNBC do. 3, that would be the only thing that people would be talking about. They would not be talking about the fact that he lost the House of Representatives.
I've never seen a press aide also positioned in the
Thank
press
you.
conference like that ever.
Right,
So
to grab the mic.
was that a plant sort of thing going
So is
on
that-
she was going to grab the mic? I've
It's
never
that
seen that happen.
manipulation
Yeah.
of the relationship, and I think J. Mart's absolutely right. Donald Trump thrives on it. He wants it. He was his own press person at a time where he would call folks at the New York Times
What's his
and
name?
the
Chris
Washington-
Barron?
Right.
Something
Yes.
that was his name.
John Barron.
John Barron.
Barron.
John Barron.
He
It's
would
John
call into
Barron
CNN
calling.
during the primaries. He would call into the control room and complain about things or give them information or tell them that he was going somewhere during the primary.
I mean, think about that. He had the phone number to the control room of a national cable
Right.
network.
Can you imagine?
I mean,
The one he hates.
Yeah.
The one he hates.
Okay,
so
so-
we got. I guess my final point. I'll let you. The thing is, we need to just stop playing the game with him, and stop engaging on his terms. And I think it starts with the media, sort of, in which we've already started to see in some cases, not cover everything this man utters, tweets, etc.
Thank you. So there was a time, and what a glorious time it was, when programs like the one Betsy executive produced for a long time, Meet the Press on NBC News, or the New York Times in the media space, would literally set the agenda and would basically say, here are the issues that matter, here are the facts around those issues, now let's have the debate. So my question is, in today's world, does broadcast news, does NBC, and I don't want to pick on a program, but it seems like there's no program like Meet the Press that is galvanizing to that extent, A, and B, Jonathan, it seems like even the New York Times can't always get the kind of traction that you would expect. The expose on Trump's taxes, for instance, was an extraordinary story, 12,000 words. and it landed and disappeared. So first to Betsy, is there a program like Meet the Press that exists today on the broadcast networks, and does broadcast news drive the agenda, or is it now cable?
I think it's totally reactionary now, and I think it did drive the news. I mean, the whole existence for the Sunday shows was to give some news for the Monday morning headlines in papers, right? I mean, that was what we were constantly top of mind, is to make news on Sundays so that your show, your news person would be on the front page, of the New York Times on Monday morning. Now it is, with the 24/7 news cycle, Twitter, news coming from every which way, it's all reactionary. I mean, when I first started at Meet the Press back in the early 90s, not to date myself, but we would book the show on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, top of mind thinking, okay, what story can we focus on to actually move that story forward? That was always what we would be thinking about. How do we take something that's going on and add to it and move it forward? These days, with the way that news flows and sort of that constant, breaking news all over the place, those shows don't get booked now until like a Friday afternoon. Yeah, and you probably know just from, okay, you're on, Chairman Seal, can you come on the show? Yeah. This is, a phone call that you get on Tuesday. Oh, sure, I'm available, let me know. Thursday, okay, we'd like to have you on. Friday afternoon, nope, sorry, we're changing the show. And that never used to happen. And we would book a show on a Tuesday, and then we would spend literally 3 or 4 days doing the research, prepping the questions, coming up with the graphics, and that show was built around being able to sustain a 25-minute, 30-minute, very intense, tough but fair interview. And that doesn't happen anymore because the shows are booked, like I said, on a Friday afternoon. You've got 4 or 5 questions for a 6-minute segment, and you've got senators stacked up down the line, 2 or 3 questions here. Okay, thank you, sir. Next, 2 or 3 questions. And you can't drive an agenda. You can't move a story forward in a 3 or 4 or 5 minute interview segment. It used to be that the Sunday shows, if you were a senator or a candidate and you had news to make, you would wait to make it on a Sunday show. These days, there's so many other places to go. If you have news to make on a Wednesday, you're on CNN Wednesday night making it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Or you're on Twitter.
yeah.
And to jumping off on your point, so from time to time, I guest anchor Joy Reid's show on MSNBC, which is on Saturday and Sunday. They will book the Friday show probably starting around Wednesday, thinking about what the Saturday show would be. Before, they would book Saturday and Sunday around the same time, to Betsy's point. But now in the age of Trump, they book the Saturday show by about Wednesday, Thursday. They don't even bother with the Sunday show until maybe Friday night, Saturday.
Right.
Because you never know what's going to happen. And whereas on Meet the Press back in the day, you would spend 3-4 days coming up with questions and really good questions. On Joy's show, there are no scripted questions. It's here's the topic, here's what we're going to talk about, and then it is up to Joy, or in that case, in a couple of weeks, it'll be up to me to come up with questions right then and there. Because you never know. You come in off the air, breaking news, President Trump just tweeted that troops are going to the border, and then you have to jump. You can't prepare for things like that.
Jonathan Martin, 12,000 words, Trump taxes.
Right.
In an earlier time, it might have led to impeachment hearings, and it just disappeared. How was that received inside the Times, and is it possible after that experience for you to say that the Times can set an agenda and drive it?
The Times can set an agenda. It's just more relative to the moment that we're in now. Just a different environment now. There's so much news, like a geyser happening every day. Not just Trump, but just across the world. People are inundated with news. They consume news in like bite-sized nuggets now. It's the corner of the eye, Chiron, at the airport. They see CNN. It's the news alert on their phone. There is people just sort of like during the course of a day, they get little sort of like flashes of news, and that's how they consume it now. I don't think that leads to a good diet, to tell you the truth, of nuggets. But that's sort of the reality of where we're at. That's the technology. I think the other issue is, you mentioned the tax story in particular. I just think with Trump, people are dug in, and even presenting pretty damning information like that doesn't change the minds of the 38 to 40% of the country that wants to support him. They're kind of unmovable, and I think that kind of a story that, the reaction to that kind of a story with the Trump supporters is, I know he's not perfect, I know he's a little, sort of shady, perhaps, but he's shaking up the system. Washington needed to be overturned. He's doing that. And maybe it's not pretty, and maybe he's a blunt instrument, but that's what we need. I mean, they'll always find a way to kind of, spin whatever the story is. So it's not that surprising, to tell you the truth. But it does raise the question about Mueller, right? Like, what does Mueller have to come back with that would actually move some people? Because right now, public opinion is pretty dug in. There's just not a lot of middle ground with this president. But yeah, on the bigger issue, Steve, there's no question that the agenda setting is now done in a more relative place. I mean, I still think that it's the most important place to go, but it's one of cacophony,
right. So you mentioned bite-sized news, which is a great transition to, and I want to direct this to both Josh and to Michael. Josh, I want you to talk for a minute, if you would, about the bite-sized fake news that voters got on Facebook in 2016.
Actual fake news.
Right, bite-sized actual fake news. I do this all the time. I'll say, I read I don't remember where, I read somewhere this.
Right.
I don't really remember where I read it. Now, I'm pretty careful about where I go read stuff, but many people aren't. And I'll confuse where I got a piece of information. So talk for a little bit about the bite-sized news that was fake from Facebook. And Michael, to you, I just want you to think about this. It seems like this is true at all the cable networks, but we'll take MSNBC where you're a commentator. It's like they decide in the morning almost that they're going to focus on this one little thing all day long. And it just becomes a constant wheel of conversation about that one little thing until the next little thing. And sometimes it's not until the next day that there's the next little thing.
Yeah.
But so I want you to, so that's a bite-sized cable question. Yours is a bite-sized Facebook question. Start with Facebook.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So we had a study in the field during the 2016 election where it was a three-wave panel survey of people who we were coming back to 3 times over the election to ask them questions about social media consumption. But as part of this study, we gave people the option to share their Facebook data with us as for academic research. And about half of our Facebook users in our survey, so about 80% of them reported having Facebook accounts, and half of them agreed to share their Facebook feed with us. Not their feed, but what they had posted on Facebook. So after the election, when there was all this attention to fake news, we were actually in this position where we could go see who was actually sharing fake news, who posted fake news online during the election.
Was it John Anzalone?
Yeah, so we used, so what we did to avoid biasing, we took lists that other people had put together. So we started with Craig Silverman's BuzzFeed list, where he had identified these really fake news things. So this is not hyperpartisan, this is not Breitbart, this is like the Denver Guardian, which is a newspaper that does not exist, right? That pretended.
Right.
So we're talking kind of Macedonian teenager fake news here. And there's 2 big findings that come out of this. The first is, and this goes on the sort of optimistic side that people have been talking about, and there are other studies who've looked at this from other directions with Twitter and with some browsing that are coming to similar conclusions. The story of fake news in 2016 is what we call a power law. So most people in our sample didn't share any fake news, and small numbers of people shared quite a bit of it. So that's the first thing to know. This was not necessarily a widespread phenomenon.
Were they people or were they bots?
These are people. These are people who are from a survey firm. We were getting their data because they were actually people who gave this data to it. So this is not a bot. This is not a bot-based study. These are actually people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is because we actually had these people, not just their Facebook data, but we had them as part of a panel survey, we knew things about them. We knew their sociodemographic characteristics. So we were able to look at actually what characteristics correlate with people who share fake news. The first two are not surprising. It's Republicans and conservatives. And there are some social psychological theories about why conservatives might be more likely to do things like this. But we also know that in the context of this election, there was a huge supply side issue here. There was just much more pro-Trump or really anti-Clinton fake news out there than there was the other way around. So I'm not willing to sort of close the door on this. I want to see what these partisan patterns look like in the context of the Democrats being the out party, and we'll see what happens on this. So that's not particularly surprising. The second, though, characteristic is that it was people who were older who shared fake news, and in particular, people over the age of 65. So this is a monotonically increasing relationship. The older you get, the more likely you are to share fake news.
It's all your grandparents' kids.
Parents.
On the Facebook, what is this?
Josh, was there an education component to that? Was there an education component to that?
No. There's no education,
Yeah.
and it's controlling for education, it's controlling for income,
Right.
and it's controlling for partisanship. This is not just that Republicans are more popular among older voters. This was age was the definitive finding here of what led to fake news. So that leads to the big question of why it is, right, that people who are older are sharing fake news. And the sort of Occam's razor answer to this is digital literacy.
Yeah.
Yes,
So I
totally.
tell
Oh, this
people
is on
my
the
age
internet,
tell
true.
our, people
Yeah.
our age tell our
Totally,
parents to go online
totally.
to
Yeah.
see pictures of our grandkids. They get online, they see something from the New York Times that's a picture, a headline, and a blurb, and then they see another article that's a picture, a
Same
headline,
thing.
a blurb,
Same
saying that the FBI agent who caught Hillary Clinton having sex with Huma Abedin has killed himself,
Yeah.
and they're really upset about this, and they want to tell their friends because this seems really bad, right? So, so that's the
That
simple
really
answer.
happened, you know.
Big, big if true.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's
Wait.
the simple answer, right?
Say it.
The simple answer is that it's Occam's razor. It's digital literacy,
Yeah.
right? Or,
It's-
or
yeah.
that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump or all these other things.
It's your grandparents or like your uncle who 15 years ago would forward you the email. Did you see this? And it was like, forwarded like 30 times, you know what I'm talking about? And it was like, some crazy, that's just now hopped the tracks and it's now over on Facebook now. But it's the same principle of like a lack of digital literacy and like not knowing like what is obviously
Well, I
fake.
want-
Like you guys who are younger and students, if you see the picture of the shark swimming in the interstate after the storm, like that freaking shark has been in so many storms now, and it's like you guys will like laugh at that, right? You guys will laugh at that, but like your grandparents, your like aunt and uncle, like holy shit, like there's a shark swimming in the interstate after Hurricane fill in the blank, and it's like no, that shark has made his way around the country in so many interstates. It's the same shark. It's not real, and you guys know that. But like again, your grandparents don't realize that. They just see the picture, like oh my gosh, that storm was so bad that there's even a shark now swimming in the interstate.
So
That's my obsession.
that's probably that's
They're
what
talking about the-
that's what we call the simplest explanation. That would be the simple explanation, Occam's razor, that it's digital literacy. But there are other potential explanations, right? Another reason that people might share things would be not that they think it's true. They think the shark is really in the interstate, right? With that one, they probably
It's
do.
not, right.
But that, with some of these other things, it might be the case that people are sharing these things knowing they're probably not true, but they're a way of showing their identity online, right? So someone, when I presented this in many cases, somebody said, I kept telling my mother-in-law this isn't true, and she finally said, yeah, I know it's not true, I just want to make sure my friends know I hate Hillary Clinton. Right? So it might be the case that this is something that doesn't have to do with digital literacy, it has something to do with other things that co-vary with age. And I think it's really, I think this points to two things. It's really important to do the kind of basic research with these kind of new phenomenon that are emerging with people consuming so much information about politics in new ways and in new formats. Because if you're trying to design interventions that are going to address this problem, right? One thing people have done to deal with fake news is to go into high schools and teach high school students digital literacy. I'm all for teaching high school students digital literacy, but if this is right, that's not what's going to solve the problem here, right? There should be other places teaching people digital literacy.
They need to
right?
actually kill their grandparents, right?
And if it's not digital literacy, then we need to know what else it is, because there are lots of people out there spending a lot of money trying to design interventions that are going to make the situation better, and you need kind of basic research to understand the phenomenon and the mechanisms so that you can inform policy solutions to these questions.
So, Michael, when the shark was swimming down the interstate, why did MSNBC cover it all day long?
Because there's a shark swimming down the interstate, and that's news, and that
People are watching.
and people are watching, and I think that's a big part of the cycle that cable news stations find themselves in, and they're selective about it. I mean, as was already noted, there are some storylines that MSNBC and CNN will follow, and there are other storylines. The same storyline will not be followed by Fox, and Fox will be on with something that the other networks aren't covering. And what that basically boils down to is their respective audiences. I know I've talked to folks who will say that about Tuesday's elections, I need 24 seats. I'm like, you need 24 seats. Why do you need 24 seats? Meaning they needed the Democrats to get 24 seats. Why? Because that now sets up the next 2 years of tension and conflict and narratives that will be covered by cable news. So for all of the I guess humble sort of, oh my God, we're put upon by Trump and Republicans hate us or Democrats love us, there is beneath this this sense of how these networks and cable stations do push narratives out, and they do sustain them. So if the president will, let's say, okay, remove the Attorney General of the United States, that's a big story. So arguably you will cover that all day long. It's a big deal. But if the president decides to go after a particular personality or to tweet something about someone or something, that may or may not be a big story worth covering for 6 hours. Mm-hmm. You can make a reference maybe at the top of each hour and then move on to other news. But the truth of it is it pushes their audience to stay tuned. And their audience then consumes that. And you just mentioned the consumption of politics. That's what it is. It all kind of gets conflated into one big bubble gum. And have you ever tried, you start with one piece of bubble gum and it's pretty good. And then you know how we are. I'll put another one in there. You keep chewing because that kind of gets a little less sweet. You throw a third piece in the mouth. Yeah, okay, maybe it's me, but that's what I do. And after a while, you've got a wad of bubble gum in your mouth and you're like this. And that's what it becomes. It becomes this laborious, very difficult thing to do all day long. And how do I know it? Because then I will get a call to talk about something I don't want to talk about. Because I figured that, we did that at 10 o'clock this morning. Why are we still talking about it on Hardball at 7? But what then happens, as you and I both know, having spent many time on a Hardball set, is throughout the day, each program, right, has to have a piece of that story.
Right.
So
they compete with each other.
They compete with each other. So whether they want to talk about it or not, they're forced into that box where they have to add another wad of bubble gum to their already full mouth.
And they have to cue the music. And
right.
Da-da-da-da-da,
right, exactly.
Chiron comes flying in.
Exactly.
And then there's Chris chewing the bubble gum.
And if you find that, for example, by the time you get to the prime time programming, which did begin at 7, now has slipped back because we've got Meet the Press at 5, so you get the real serious piece. So that's a sliding scale. Everybody's got to get a piece of, so you never get away from the story. Mm-hmm. And I remember back during the campaign where Donald Trump would text Joe Scarborough on set, 6:15, text, and then you see the back and forth. By 6:45, he was on the air, and whatever happened between 6:45 and 7:15 was what we talked about all day long. And so you have this that's where it really kind of began, where the news sort of created itself, and then you put the graphics behind it, you put the sound with it, and you're off and running on a non-story. You've just made a story.
So now we're going to go to the lightning round. And the lightning round is questions from the audience with really short answers from the panel. Please direct, if you can, your question, if you have one, to an individual, A, and then B, to that individual. Please answer briefly because we're actually running out of time quickly. We only have a few minutes.
I had a question for Jonathan. I just wondered whether that long article had ever been considered to be in pieces to continue and to keep addressing day after day the tax issue.
I can't speak to the internal deliberations on that. I'm actually based in D.C., not New York, so I don't have a lot of interaction day in, day out with the folks in New York who do that kind of project. So I don't know the answer to that. I think the idea was to sort of do it in one fell swoop because it's more powerful that way, and that's how they wanted to package it. And frankly, I don't know if it would have had any different impact if it had been spread out over a week or even 3 days. Again, people look at that story through the prism of their own preconceived notions, and if they are convinced that Trump's a crook, then that's going to reinforce it, and if they're convinced that he's the second coming, then that's not going to change it. Is that depressing? A little bit, right? But that's kind of where we are, I think, right now. And it's new information does not have the same kind of impact that it would with the president.
Let me just add another group there, not only in the reaction to the tax story, or for that matter, the reaction to the story that Trump was behind and orchestrated the payments to Stormy and those stories, which are cast as breaking news. And outside of those who believe what they want of Trump and no one can pierce that armor with facts, and those who do, there's also a group now, I put myself in this, that of course he cheated on his taxes.
Right.
Everyone knew he cheated on his
Right.
taxes. Why didn't he release his tax returns? Everyone in New York City knows he cheats on everything.
Right.
So there's also this...
People are nerd to it, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not only a nerd. I think they've already absorbed it.
Yeah.
Taken
it's
it in.
baked in, right. It's baked
not-
in that
it's baked in,
that
and-
he was an adulterer and tax cheat, right.
And there was a moment where I thought, I need 12,000 words to confirm what everybody...
Yeah, I mean...
you are making the obvious inescapable.
Right.
I'll give you that. But that is not the same as having that kind of an impact.
I say this over and over again. We did a lot of stories in 2016 about Trump and his background, business, his personal conduct. People had their eyes wide open when they voted for him in 2016. Nobody can say that they didn't know what they were getting, right? Like people knew what the story was, and some of them were okay with that. So, it's not like they can say, well, I didn't know about X, Y, Z. It's like, well, of course you knew that he did this kind of thing. It's not a huge revelation.
But it doesn't mean that those stories shouldn't be written and that those investigations shouldn't be done. I mean...
But if you're saying what's the impact, Jonathan, why did everybody wake up and go, my hair's on
True.
fire, I can't believe Donald Trump cheated on taxes. But making the obvious inescapable is, of course, what academicians do. This is what Josh Tucker does for a living, and that's what you want. You want the record there.
Right.
But I wish that there's a... What would make news is I was trying to think of covering something contrarian to what people have already
Yeah.
told. Like actually Donald Trump saves a stray dog. That would be, or, but playing always the politicians, playing to what we already have absorbed about.
Right.
Dan Quayle is done.
Right.
Bill Clinton.
It's the narrative. It's the narrative,
The narrative is already there.
Yeah.
So it's editorially, it would be interesting to see putting time and resources into what stories out there that nobody did.
It's like the old SNL skit where Reagan, where Reagan came off as this total killer behind closed doors. Do you remember that? And it was like secretly he was actually this iron hand. Yeah.
So I'll be quick. 3 journalists, Jonathan, and Betsy, or former journalist. Do you believe that part of the credibility problem in the media is being created by the number of journalists who are now appearing as commentators on television instead of just doing their jobs and reporting their news in their various outlets?
I think it's a factor. I think it's a relatively small one in the grand scheme of things.
I think the way the business has changed, reporters have to be on multiple platforms. I just say for myself, I understand the criticism of reporters on Twitter, which is why I never curse on Twitter. I never retweet things I try not to, that have curses in them. I try to make sure that my Twitter feed is as credible as the stuff I write. And that's something where I see sometimes on Twitter the things that are written by journalists where I'm the opinion writer and I won't even put stuff that I see some news site journalists put out there. So, I mean, yeah, that is part of the problem.
No, I mean, it drives me nuts. You know, we would I came from a show, Meet the Press, where we would tie ourselves in knots every single week to make sure that the show was very balanced and it was never opinionated. And I think, Jonathan is Jonathan Capehart, an opinion journalist, and that's fine. But if you're a straight journalist, I should not know your political views and opinions. It shouldn't happen. Tim Russert was the moderator of Meet the Press, came from Democratic politics, and I can tell you in the 17 years I worked with him, he never even articulated a political opinion back and forth with me, and we spoke 100 times a day, because that's how serious he was about sort of maintaining that objectivity every single week on the air. So the opinionated kind of the straight journalist that goes on and then has opinion, and I will say, again, to continue my bash on cable news, sometimes these programs will have a straight journalist on and then spend the entire time trying to bait them and get them to give opinions and put them in a very difficult position. So, I always tell journalists, be careful. Sure, you want to be out there and promote your article, et cetera, but be careful in the kind of shows that you go on to, and you go on with someone else too. They will put a straight journalist on with an opinion journalist and expect you to have kind of a back and forth debate. You don't want to put yourself in that kind of environment.
Just a couple more. Lightning round. Lightning.
My question's for Professor Tucker. Do you ever think there could be a time where the U.S. government kind of places internet censorship for the sake of keeping civil peace? To prevent something like the Arab Spring from happening on social media, kind of in the States, or prevent an uprising from happening on social media due to a circulation of fake news or...
I mean, I'm not going to tell you what the government is or is not going to do in the future. I can tell you that there are lots of discussions when you go to convenings on people who are talking about speech online, and there is a lot of interest in trying to roll back both incivility online, hate speech online, and fake news online. And it's a very dangerous you have to be very careful on the road you walk here, right? Because what ostensibly is happening is people are saying, we want to give the power to a very, very large, very, very rich multinational corporation to decide what's legitimate speech, right? And we've all seen things online that we don't think should be there, and Facebook is a private company. But I mean, imagine the same people saying, you know what I really think we should do? We should let ExxonMobil discuss what people are going to talk about politics, right? Everyone would have a heart attack about that. And so I think it absolutely is being discussed, right? And there's legislation across the world that is addressing this in different places, and there is not to be dismissed. There is tremendous pressure on politicians to do things about this, right? I briefed members of the British Parliament on my research on this, and it was like they didn't want to hear a word that I was saying because they had preconceived notions. They wanted me to say that hate speech was going way up and that this was a major problem, and when I said something more nuanced than that, that was the end of the conversation. So there's a lot of pressure right now to do something about this, and I do think it's really important to take a pause and get the facts right. When things are power laws, when it's really small numbers of people engaging in egregious behavior, that's really different than huge trends across the board. And these are some long-standing norms we have, especially in the United States, but it's very different in Europe. And looking at how this has been addressed in Germany versus the United States versus Britain is a very interesting question. And I think you're asking absolutely the right question, and it's not an easy answer.
Just one more.
This is for anyone who feels they can answer. What do you think the governments have as a responsibility to save these local newspapers? Should they save them? Should they intervene, or should they not intervene?
I mean, I don't want the government to intervene. I want I want a concerned and informed citizenry to spend their money to sustain local newspapers. Failing that, I think, sad to say, but I think the idea of civic angels who can afford to lose money to prop up newspapers is maybe the only way to go. I mean, we're seeing this certainly with the Washington Post with Jeff Bezos, but I think if there are people in this country who care about democracy, who care about an informed electorate, and they have the resources to buy and lose money on papers, that may be the only way to keep them going.
I think also Facebook should be paying. I mean, all the content that's on Facebook and all the ads and the money that they get for sharing content online, they should be contributing toward the newspapers. I think.
They have initiatives like this to support.
Yeah, but they.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think they're aware of that thing. I mean, one thing that governments can do, one aspect of this, that and also, you know, people who are interested in supporting local journalism, I think one way they can intervene that's not intervening in the market is to provide scholarships for students going to journalism schools, because since the market has become so unstable for journalists, at least ensuring that students who still want to get real training can do so without going into massive debt to do it is one way that I think that you can sort of prop this up a little bit, because I think this is one of the big questions about the gatekeepers, is that journalists used to be trained and now with the sort of advent of citizen journalism, kind of anyone can do this. Yes. And so anything that keeps that pipeline open of people going to school, getting training in sort of being a journalist, I think is valuable. And that's one way you can do it without directly intervening in the market.
Just one more. You've had your hand up for a little while.
Since I was 13, I had a curiosity, and I would like to be well informed. I would like to be well informed. I'm your, how should I say, I would like to be, I want you all to know I would like to be well informed. However, I have withdrawn from a variety of sources because what I have to absorb or listen to or read in my effort to be well informed is really not time productive or time efficient. I am curious to know from any of you or each of you if you're witness to what has, I have the impression, and I would like your response to this impression, that the campaign and presidency of Trump has acted as a kind of emetic, that it has driven content, and including the New York Times, frankly. Like when I look at the front page and the second page and the third page, it seems organized by him. Meaning by his presence, by something he said, by something we discover about him. It's as if nothing in the world is happening but Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's unfair.
Well, it's just when I travel, and I do, as an educator, quite a bit.
Well, if you want to pull up the page right now, you'll see Trump stories. You'll see tons of non-Trump stories. I mean, I think,
but it's not that they're not non-Trump stories. It feels like the mind of it is. In some way, again, and believe me, I'm as outraged by him as the rest of them.
First of all, I think that there's plenty of non-Trump stories, but second of all, of course there's going to be stories that are shaped by him. This is like a norm-breaking president that is an extraordinary story in the history of the country. Like, we'd be irresponsible not to cover some of the ways that he is shaping American politics. You had the American president close out a midterm campaign by making racially driven, in some cases racist statements about...
Racist, you can say it. I'll say it.
Well, I just did.
A racist closing message.
So, like, of course we're going to cover that. It's like...
You're just saying you want to.
It's like telling the folks in Tokyo, like, why are you talking about Godzilla?
You're just saying you want to tune it out, like you've reached kind of.
No, it's not that I necessarily want to tune it out. Yes, I understand what you're saying. I understand explicitly what's necessary for me to know.
Yes.
What I'm saying is that even as we led up to the midterm, I'm aware of the fact that there's so much coverage that is not helping the voter and is not managing a proliferation of good information. It's necessary to make a conscious and deliberate choice about issues.
Okay, fair point, good point. I think we'll leave it there unless somebody feels like they have something they have to say. Is there anything you have to say?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.